Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining in to tonight's Zoom Parsha Shiur. I want to dedicate this shiur to a very, very good friend of mine and Susie's who tragically passed away this week. His name was Mark Tannenbaum, who is lovingly referred to by everyone who knew him as T. Moshe Mordechai ben Fischel Simcha. He was a leader of the Zionist Israel-loving community in Chicago and beyond. And so I'm hoping that this learning will be a aliyat neshama for him specifically during the week of his Shiva. So I want to talk to you. We're on a very, very fascinating and baffling Parsha. I call it the Baffling Birthright Parsha, because there are so many. We know the story, the sale of the birthright that gives the Bechorah the leading position in the nation to Yaakov as opposed to Esav. But so many questions abound about this story that I think all of us, when we read it, occurs to us that something doesn't make sense here. For one thing, it's a story of deception of Yaakov along with Rivka, in many ways led by Rivka, as we'll see, deciding to deceive husband and father Yitzchak into granting the primary leadership position as exemplified, personified by the Bechorah to Yaakov as opposed to Esav, even though Esav is technically the firstborn. There's a whole discussion, first in, first out in terms of the womb, but we consider Esav certainly to be the firstborn, who would normally be the one upon whom the mantle of leadership would descend. Of course, we know that's not always true. We see in Jewish history that very often the elder does not inherit the prime position. We see it, for example, in the story of Yaakov's children. Reuven is the firstborn, then Shimon, Levi, Yehuda is number 4. We see this in the story of David HaMelech, where Shlomo is not his firstborn, and yet is still given the kingship. So that in and of itself becomes almost a pattern, perhaps even based upon what happens in this parsha. But the whole idea of deception and literally pulling the wool over Yitzchak's eyes, which is where this comes from, that does not sit well with us, that they would have to resort to this kind of deceit in order to achieve their aims. So I want to try to understand, give two different slants of the Chachamim, of the commentators, about what may be going on here. First of all, we can ask a simple question. This deal that Yaakov seems to make with Esav about trading a bowl of lentils, soup, whatever it was, for the birthright, this is something which we would call in halachic terms a mekach taot. It would be a sale, a transaction that does not follow the law for a number of reasons. First of all, the birthright is something that will only occur later. It doesn't even exist as long as Yitzchak is alive, because he is still the standard bearer as long as he's living. So this is what we call a davar shelo ba le'olam. You're trying to make a deal over something which doesn't even exist at the moment. And Chazal question whether any kind of a deal for something like this would be honored, would need to be honored. Secondly, clearly this is done under false pretenses. When Yitzchak does give his primary blessing to Yaakov, it certainly is something that is not done with truth and with all the parties being on the same page. Yitzchak is thinking, this is Esav, I'm giving the birthright to my oldest son, only later to find out that he is indeed not the oldest son. So this is something that in a court of law, we would certainly be able to undo. For example, you go to somebody and say, I'd like to sell you an expansive amazing piece of land. It's in southern Israel. It's beachfront property. And you sign some deal, and then the person finds out, wow, I just bought some sand in Gaza. Well, you'd have every right to come back and say, you misled me. And this was never done openly, honestly, and it has a right to be called back. So here too, once Yitzchak finds out that he's been fooled, that this really isn't his son Esav, but rather Yaakov, he has every right to say, let's take it back. And yet, the Torah tells us, when we look carefully at the verses here, he's even after Yitzchak finds out that he has been duped, nevertheless, he makes the statement after Esav comes and tells him, Dad, you were fooled. Nevertheless, he listens and he says, Gam Baruch Hu. Nevertheless, this blessing is going to stand. Why does he do that? There is an opinion that says once given a blessing, it can never be taken back, even by God. But in legal terms, it's certainly a case could be made for it. So for him to say the blessing remains with Yaakov in spite of his deception, that doesn't sit very well. So I want to suggest that perhaps right in the very beginning, when the sale begins, the pasuk says, "Vayomer Yaakov Michra Chayom et bechorat chali." Sell this birthright to me, what seems to be today, but it doesn't say Hayom, which is to say today. It is Chayom, as if it was today, as if I had the ability to actually do this transaction, which I don't have now. Thus, this slight change from Hayom to Chayom, telling us that this isn't necessarily a real sale. This is setting up a certain scenario to kind of judge and test what Esav is all about. And of course, Yaakov sees Esav doesn't really want this. He's not interested in it. He would rather trade it for a meal to satisfy his immediate urge than to think long term, I'm going to be the one that's going to lead the family and ultimately, you might say, the Jewish people. Rivka understands this. And Rivka and Yaakov, they conduct a very elaborate plan in order to show Yitzchak the light. Yitzchak, and again, there are two opinions on this, but certainly in this particular idea, the expectation or the suspicion is that Yitzchak doesn't really know what Esav is all about. That Esav, Tzayid B'piv, he had literally that he gave him meat to eat, but someone to say that it means he could, like he trapped an animal, he trapped his father Yitzchak into believing something that really wasn't so, and that Yitzchak was maybe impressed by his strength, his masculinity, whatever it may have been, into thinking that, well, maybe he is the natural-born leader. Rivka knows better. She's in the tradition of Sarah and also later Leah and Rachel, but certainly following upon the example of Sarah, who knows better, who tells Abraham, her husband, you can't keep Ishmael in the house. He can't be an equal to our son Yitzchak. And although Abraham wants to keep Ishmael there, nevertheless, Hashem intercedes and says, Kol asher tomar lecha, Sarah shma b'kolah. You have to listen to your wife. She knows better. So in this scenario, according to Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, it's a brilliant idea. They are basically setting up I won't say a trap, but they're setting up a series of events in order to somehow cause Yitzchak to see the light. So, although in a sense he is indeed fooled by what goes on, at some point he comes to realize, maybe I don't really see things the way they're supposed to be. If I thought that Yitzchak was Esav and Yaakov was Esav and Esav was Yaakov, maybe I don't see things clearly. After all, we are told that Yitzchak at this time was blind, thinking Rivka, maybe he's not only blind in the sense of physically seeing, but maybe he also doesn't see exactly who his sons are. She sets up this whole elaborate play, if you will, directs the action of this play so that at some point, Yitzchak comes to the realization, I was fooled. I thought that this really was Esav when it was in truth Yaakov. Maybe I'm wrong about everything. Maybe I was fooled into thinking that the natural born leader is Esav and not Yaakov. At that point, it's a kind of the asimon, or the penny drops, and Yitzchak thinks to himself, maybe all these years, I haven't really seen things for what they truly are. And therefore, he makes this decision, Gam Baruch Hu, the blessings are going to stay right where they are. And indeed, Yaakov retains this, even though it still hasn't effectively come to reality as long as Yitzchak is alive, but will when he dies. There's another approach, though, that I think bears and is certainly worthy of thinking about. Because okay, we'll turn that off. Let's remember that Yitzchak is a Navi. He's the leader of the family, but he also is a prophet. And to say that he doesn't understand what's going on with his sons and who is truly the one deserving of leadership, that's not so simple to accept, because I think it's wrong to portray Yitzchak as someone who is foolish or someone who doesn't understand human nature. That's a pretty heavy thing to lay upon one of the avot. So some want to suggest Yitzchak understood more or less what was happening here, but he had a plan. His plan was, I have two sons. They're different, but they each have great strengths. Somehow, if we can form a union, a partnership, a deal between the two of them, we can really change the world. Because Esav, he is let us say, the material or the materialistically minded son, which the world needs. The world needs builders. The world needs creative thinkers who are going out and who are forming cities and who are leading other people. Yaakov is different. He's more reserved. Yoshev Ohalim. He sits inside the tent. He's a scholar. He's spiritual. We need a combination of the spiritual and the material. And this idea that Yitzchak has is a wonderful, revolutionary, idyllic concept. Let's combine the two worlds. Indeed, you see that when the brachot are given, and many people look at this and they're mystified because the two primary elements within both of these brachot are material wealth, material success, which we define through this phrase, shmanei haaretz, the fat of the land, and also spiritual greatness, which we call tala shamayim, the dew of heaven. And they both receive it. The only difference is who is going to get what first? Who has the priority? In the blessing which ultimately comes to being, Yaakov is given first Tala Shamayim and then Shmanei Haaretz. And in the bracha given to Esav, it's reversed. Both of them share in both these blessings. You can be materialistically successful and also be a person with deep faith in God, a spiritual person, but your primary strength is in the material world. And you can also be a person of spirit, and yet you can be wealthy, you can be successful in the world at large. That's fine. There's no shame in that at all. It's just a question of where your primary strengths lie. So Yitzchak's thinking was, let's make some kind of, again, partnership where these two great forces can come together and build a world that is also spiritually, if not perfect, spiritually minded. And that is what Yitzchak wanted to do. You might think the partnership or the combination of, let's say, Bill Gates and the Lubavitcher Rebbe, they decide to work together. Can you imagine the world that they can create? And this is what Yitzchak had in mind. It's a very visionary and I would say revolutionary idea. Unfortunately, as Rivka proves, Esav isn't ready for that. And instead of working hand in hand with Yaakov, the two of them are always going to be rivals and even enemies. And though he had a wonderful idea, Yitzchak, it would not come to pass. But someday, this idea of Yitzchak can, should, and I believe will come to pass. This is also something which was predicted, or was the concept, when Yehuda Hanasi was the leader of the Jewish people, that he had this relationship with Antoninus, with the emperor of Rome. Here too, it was the same idea. If we can combine these two great forces, Rome and Jerusalem, Rome and Yerushalayim, these are two mighty powers representing the material world and the spiritual world. Of course, it did not come to pass. It did not happen in the time of Yaakov and Esav, nor in the time of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, Rebbe, and the Roman emperor. But the dream is that someday it will come about, and these two worlds, rather than colliding, will come together, and then we will have the platform, if you will, upon to build this more perfect society that will usher in the dream that all of us have, the ultimate of bringing together these powers so that Moshiach will step upon the scene and we will have the Geula Shalema Bimherim V'Yameinu. Amen. So we say this as a Aliyat Neshama for T, for Moshe Mordechai ben Fishel Simcha, that he should be a Melitz Yosher for all of us. He was a lover of Am Yisrael, Medinat Yisrael, and Klal Yisrael, and that should be hopefully a zchut for him and also for all of us. Thank you for tuning in. We will be back again in 2 weeks when I return from a trip to Chutz La'aretz. Thank you all for tuning in. Shabbat Shalom.